Welcome to AHA Calligraphy, calligraphy with that special touch. My name is Fran, and this program is concerning pen calligraphy. The materials that you see in front of me are some that we're going to be using as we practice writing beautiful letter forms. These forms are going to be shown to you in detail so that you'll understand how you can make these at home. We'll also be looking at finished pieces using calligraphy, that art of beautiful writing. Some of the materials that you see in front of me that we'll be using are pens, inks, papers, writing boards. We'll be looking at each one of these and understanding how you can use these for studying calligraphy yourself. The history of calligraphy has a very rich tradition that letter forms going back for centuries have been used by people to communicate. And the forms that we're going to be looking at have all derived from those historical letter forms. My goal is that you not only have good letter forms and a good model for those forms, but that you feel inspired artistically and that you can then view this program repeatedly for your own maximum benefit. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, was first done on the walls of caves and then done in clay tablets to record events or sales of goods. And we also see it written on papyrus with a reed from Egypt. And we see that these forms have been made with a blunt cut reed so that there are thick and thin lines instead of just a monoline. Next in use we find the quill, which was a flight feather, and it had extra strength for that flight feather to be used, so they cut off the end very flat so that it was much easier to write with than a point which had to be continually resharpened. The tool also makes the desirable shaded letter forms. The quill was used in this manner for about 1,500 years until metal pens with pointed tips were manufactured for handwriting. From the 1700s to the early 1900s, only pointed pens were available. Most work by scribes was not done by monks, but in workshops after the 1250s in university towns. Books were made for the aristocracy. With the invention of the printing press, however, most scribes were jobless. Calligraphy with an edged pen was a lost art. At the turn of the century, an Englishman named Edward Johnston began a revival of the use of an edged pen for formal writing. Today we have thousands of calligraphers using this tool for writing. A calligrapher strives to write beautiful letter forms and arrange them well, Johnston said. Now let's look at the writing materials that you're going to be using. The most important part is to have a good writing surface that's raised instead of a flat table. When we work on a flat table, you'll find that leaning over is going to cause a lot of muscle stress around your neck. So calligraphers use a raised surface. This writing board has been professionally made. You could make one very easily with 2 sheets of plywood and a couple hinges. My first one, I even used a coffee can to brace it up. The paper that we're using is about 17 by 22 in size, and it's just a white bond paper. It's a very inexpensive, good paper to write on, and you may find it in your stores at this size or slightly smaller at the 11 by 17 size. Inks come in various weights. You'll find some weight that is a very thin, like the Pelikan 4001 ink, works very nicely through our dip pens because it's so light and watery. And we also have inks that are thicker, like Penalac, Pelikan, Fount India, Higgins Eternal. You'll find inks that are available to you, and try them and see which one works best for you. We have various other materials to be working with through the program. The most important ones, besides the table and the ink, is our pens. The pen that I recommend you use is the Speedball C2 nib because it's got good flexibility. So as we work with it, I think it's easier if you're a beginning student. If you've had a little experience, you may prefer to go to the calligrapher's favorite. That's a Mitchell nib called Rexel, R-E-X-E-L. And this is a highly flexible pen as well by Mitchell, and it's a wonderful dip pen. And you may choose to use something easier to keep on your lap, a felt pen. Felt pens come in various widths, and this one is called a broad pen, and it's a good size for you to use as you practice these letter forms at home. We could also use fountain pens. They're not my favorite to use, so I'm not going to be using them on the program, but you might find them very convenient for practicing at home. The best ink that you can use is stick ink. And I find that so because then you get the control of the consistency of the ink. Stick ink is from the Orient, and it's a compressed stick of ink that you then grind on the stone with a few drops of water. Other tools that I have available are double pencils. Taking two pencils and rubber banding them together is an easy way for me to do some writing and get a layout idea for how something's going to look a little larger. And I also have with me a quill because they're one of my favorite tools to write with. The quill was a calligrapher's favorite for hundreds of years. And we also will be using some watercolor paints later on and working with how to write in color instead of just a black ink. So a palette will be very helpful. I also keep very close to me some tape. Drafting tape is the easiest to remove from our work, or you can use masking tape and then just rub it across your jeans a little bit so that you're taking off some of the stickiness, and it makes it easier to remove from your paper. And then we have, for ruling our guidelines, a T-square. The T-square is going to keep our consistent spaced lines ruled on the paper for our practicing as well as for our finished work. So as you see this assortment of tools, notice that many of these are for the advanced student. Those of you just beginning calligraphy, the most important tools for you would be the C2 pen, a pad of bond paper, a writing table, and a nice beginning thin ink. To prepare our pen for use, we first need to clean off the manufacturing oils. So we could dip this pen nib into our bottle of ink just a little ways, and then clean that off with a rag. And a couple of those dippings ought to make the pen ready. Or you could use a match underneath, just lightly, and then dip the nib immediately into cold water to temper the steel. The third possibility, and my favorite, is to use a little saliva. And you can just spit a little bit on that and then wipe it around the nib and then clean it off. And you could think of that as blessing the pen. I'm going to dip the pen into ink now so that we can begin our writing. I'm dipping in just to the back of the reservoir on the pen, not all the way. We don't want it to get clear up into the handle. After we've dipped in, notice the angle that this pen is held at so that there's an axis about like this to the pen as we're writing. And instead of making letter forms, I'm just going to start playing with the ink, wiggling it a little bit. Notice the pen wiggle and then begin so that we start seeing what happens with the flow of ink. And then keep dipping your pen. We're now warming up and we're doing just some play strokes so that we can get this pen started. This would be a good time to continue playing on a clean sheet of paper with no guidelines, just to see what's going to happen with the pen as we start making marks. It's important to know how to draw guidelines. We're looking at the marks made from this pen as they were pulled horizontally to measure the width of the pen. And those marks are then going to give us the height for this particular group of letter forms. These are 5 pen widths in measurement, and we'll now draw lines, as you can see, extending out from that. And I'm going to add those to my paper by pulling them up here. And I've got my paper flush against the left side of my board, and I'm simply going to put a dot and then slide this paper down. So it's acting like a ruler for me. And all the way down the page, I would make these dots. To actually rule the lines, I'll keep my paper attached to the left side of my board. I'll slide up the T-square, and to make sure I'm accurate, I'm aligning the left side of the paper pad to the T-square and the board so it's in tight. I'm going to first put my pencil exactly on the point slide the T-square up to it, and then rule the line straight across the paper. Slide down, put your pencil point in the dot, slide back up, and rule the next line. We're going to be writing letters that will take up one of these spaces. So for the ascenders and descenders, the tall and the long strokes, we're going to need extra spaces. So on every third line, I'm going to make a mark. A little X in the corner would do, and then count down. Every third line, make another little X. That will indicate our writing line. Drawing guidelines is directly related to the size of our pen nib. So with whatever size pen you are using, we must do the same measuring so that you're getting 5 pen widths. For some alphabets, you may choose 4 pen widths or 6 pen widths, but nevertheless, it's this wide flat end that is our measuring tool for determining the heights of our guidelines. The history of the Western alphabet is a rich treasury of letters that were drawn and painted and written marks that were made for communication as well as for pleasure. The word calligraphy actually comes from the Greek word kalli, which we've translated as beautiful, but meant good, and graphos, meaning marks, or writing, or drawing, or painting, even sculpting. Graphs were just marks. The letter forms we're going to look at, the lettera humanistica, actually came from the Renaissance of the 15th century. In Italy, a man named Poggio Bracciolini, who has devised this style of letters that are very legible, easy to write, beautifully rounded forms that actually became the design forms for typeface. So, humanist bookhand, as we call it, are the letters we're now going to take a look at. We're now getting ready to write letters. The first thing we need to do is understand how to hold our pen so that it's going to make the most beautiful letter forms we can make. This chart illustrates the position one would hold their hand on the pen. Notice the knuckle. I want this pen to be up here towards my knuckle instead of laying down in the valley between my thumb and index finger. Pull it up so it's a little bit easier to hold on to, and the whole edge of the pen gets onto the paper. Notice that this angle could be called a 45-degree angle. Now this is in relationship to the horizontal guideline. So that 45-degree angle is one of the positions that we may be using for some of our letter forms. To test our pen, we could actually make an X, holding it at this angle and then pulling down to make sure that the whole pen is on the page and it's making the correct angle. Notice that you can check right here in the middle to see if you're actually going from one corner to another with that 45-degree angle. This pen edge angle is very important as it determines the width of our stroke. So for any letter style you're working with, this edge angle needs to be a consistent angle within that alphabet style so that we're getting a beautiful continuous rhythm of weights from one stroke to the next. The 45-degree edge angle necessary for italic can also be altered for more specialized effects. Notice that at the top of these ascenders, I've changed to almost a 25-degree pen edge angle. And at the bottom of the descender, for the letter F, for instance, we can see that also a flattening of the pen edge angle, so that the horizontal strokes, anytime we're writing horizontal strokes in italic, will be a flatter pen edge angle. That brings a unity to the piece. Instead of having large, thick strokes moving horizontally, they've thinned out for a much more attractive letter style. And then the third chart is to show us the humanist letter forms, and this is where we're going to begin. The humanist forms are based on a circular letter, and the pen edge angle is slightly flatter. Notice we're changing down now to a 30-degree angle from the horizontal line. And this edge angle is going to give us a little bit heavier letter style than the italic. The roundness of form can take that heavier weight and still hold up to be a very lovely structure. We begin writing on these large sheets of paper, And in order to handle them better, we're going to pull them off of our tablet. So we have here just 3 sheets of paper pulled off together, so there's some padding behind our writing. I'm attaching masking tape at the top of both corners in order to secure the 3 pages together. So now I can move those all together across the writing board as I work. It's much easier if my hand stays in the same position, writing constantly, and the paper moves. So I'll write in one position and move the paper. So my hand gets very comfortable writing in one location on the board. Another piece of tape at the top will easily allow me to hold that paper still as I'm working, and then to remove that and move it over as I continue. We're ready now to begin writing our humanist bookhand alphabet in the lowercase forms. Notice that our pen edge angle is shown here at approximately 30 degrees, so make sure that the end of your pen matches that. The position in your hand is comfortable. The pen is up here against your knuckle, and we've measured these letters to be approximately 4 pen widths tall. The first strokes we could start with would be the knifing in stroke, sliding into the guideline, and then sliding back down as if we're making the letter I. These letters are without a serif right now, just to get the feel of beginning the strokes. So let's start with a series of I's. As you're working along, I'd like you to be very careful that you keep these letters parallel. You see what happens when they're not parallel? It shows up in the white spaces in between. So go slowly and carefully and just leave a small space in between each of the letters. That could be about 1 pen width or just slightly more than 1 pen width between each of the I strokes. Continue on with many of these until your hand starts feeling comfortable with this slide, knifing in, curving, straight down, touch the bottom guideline, and then exit. Then arch. Now straight down, and then exit slowly to the right. U looks like an upside down N. Notice the straight stroke and then a curve and lift, back down and again exit. The letter M has 2 arcades, each slightly narrower than the N. For good contrast, keep your straight lines very straight and strong. The letter L has a shorter ascender, this tall piece, than the guideline. We're going to move down about 1 pen width from that guideline, and notice the construction of this serif. It's a slide out to the left, slide back up in a curve and down. Lift and then go back up to the top. And continue. On our larger chart, we're able to see that clearly, where this serif is formed with this slide down, pull up and down, and then that straight stroke pulls right down through there. So those 2 strokes together will form this bracket serif. H begins like the letter L, with the same bracket serif. Slide over, a little bit up and then down, lift, straight down, go all the way to the guideline, and exit. The arch of H is that same curve, straight down and exit. And then the letter R has the same arch, but the top droops just slightly before you stop. And finally in this family, the letter K, beginning with the same serif, straight down and like the N, but curve in and then add the diagonal stroke. We now see on the model how the bracket serif at the top can be placed on the ascenders of H and L and K. And we also see the overlapping of letter forms as possibilities. You see the O shape can be here, the E shape inside of that. This connection to the L can then form a D. And now the important one is our next letter, the letter A. Notice how the letter A fits right on top of the letter N. So this same arching curve that we use to create the top of N will be the beginning stroke for A. Secondly, we'll pull the curve around as far away as the downstroke for N, and then come back to the middle and pull that third stroke in. We can study an alphabet by dividing it into family groups that are related by similar strokes. The vertical letters I and L are grouped with the H, R, and K. And also related is this N, U, M, the letter A, and the G. Notice the letter A has separated strokes that are pulled strokes. Watch the sequence as it moves from the side and then back up to the top and down. Most strokes are pulled rather than pushed, and we see that the pen works easier on the paper when it's a pulling and just gliding off the edge. The letter G begins with a small O. It sits about 1 pen width from the writing line. The tail looks like an ellipse laying on its side and can be made in 2 strokes. The 5th stroke of G is the ear, a short horizontal to the right. Now we'll move down 3 lines for your next writing line. This second family is based on a round shape. Watch your pen edge angle to make sure it's still at 30 degrees. Overlap completely for a good shape, and then look inside the O. Do you see the lemon? C begins with the O stroke, just like the letter E. But E then pulls in and then slide up to join the strokes. D begins like the C, and then like L, add the bracket, and then slide straight down. Go all the way to the writing line before you exit. Move your paper over so it's always right in front of you. Now let's begin Q. Just like the O, and then slide over and hesitate at the top, slide straight down and exit to the right. B begins with the same vertical stroke with a little bit wider base and then finishes like the right side of O. P also has this straight stroke with the right side of O, and watch the counter spaces to see that they are equal. The letter J has a pull to the left, and I pull back to make sure that I have a crisp line. That bottom stroke looks like the upside down F. Move your paper over again, and now for the letter S, begin with the shape of O to see how the strokes overlap. I like to begin with the center of S and then down for the base and finishing at the top. Both the top and bottom strokes should be touching the guidelines. The letter T also has a wide base, like we saw on B, short on the left and then a little bit longer on the right side of that horizontal bar. The third family is the diagonals, and these letters are V, W, X, Y, and Z. I steepen the pen edge angle slightly for these strokes, and notice how this W has points on the base. The second W form is shown with curves, so you do have some choice of variety. The ascenders and the descenders, the letters that go up above the waistline or down below the writing line, usually don't extend the full space, but they only go half of a space, as you'll see here in the letter Y. Then for Z, flatten your pen edge angle for the center stroke, and then back to your normal 30 degrees for the final stroke of Z. This is a sample of the humanist book hand done in the form of a letter, and as she practiced writing this, she left no space between the words. So it was strictly working on each letter form and then adding in the stamps and the illustrations. And a fun way to practice. This would be a good project to work on at home. Roman capitals are the queen of all the alphabets. Calligraphers will begin with these Roman capital basic forms so that we can understand the structure for all the letter forms that we're going to use that follow these historically. From the 1st century until now, these forms have remained consistently beautiful. As we see the structure in this illustration, we can see how they can overlap and reveal particular shapes that are consistent. The square shape, the triangular shape, and the circular form are the basic shapes used for all the Roman capital letters. So overlapping these and showing monoline, that means just a singular line, as if done with a pencil or a ballpoint pen, we can see the underlying bone to the Roman shape. We're then going to add the meat to those bones when we add the pen-written letter that would give us shading, thicks and thins. Shaded capitals are just like the basic structure we saw in the monoline capitals, except that we've now added the meat to the bones. So notice how some of the strokes are thicker and some are thinner. The basic downstroke of the H and the I and the J is all the same weight, and the horizontal bar is a thinner stroke. This gives a beautiful balance to the capital letters. As we see in the C and the S, we have that same weight on the downstroke in the center of the stroke, but up at the top and the bottom of the letters, do you see how it's lighter in weight? So notice how these letters overlap so that you can understand the structure. The bone structure underneath these forms is based on the circle and then on the two circles on top of each other, as we see on S and B. For the letter A and B, notice a little bit different structure. The A is what we call 4/5 as wide as it is high. Notice that it takes up about the inside of the letter O, whereas B is quite a bit narrower. On the letter O and P, both of them are full circle forms. One takes up the full space, one takes up half the space. So we don't try to stretch the P out, but we rather make it narrower so that it's going to look more in proportion. The Roman proportion is the most elegant design we've ever seen manifested in any of the letter forms, and for 2,000 years, all of our letter forms continue with this structure. As we see on Q, the tail is added to the O form in a diagonal. We also see a diagonal on the letter R, but since it's part of the integral shape of the letter, it's a little bit heavier stroke. On the letter L, notice again the thin horizontal bar, as we see on A, and also on T and H. The diagonal on N is a heavier stroke, and then we have the thin strokes on the side, so this requires a change in the pen edge angle that you'll see in a little bit. And finally, on the letter Y and V, these letters are showing the diagonals and how they would overlap to the other forms, and they fit within the width of the letter T and H. I'm demonstrating the capital letter forms at 8 pen widths tall. Measure with your pen along the edge of the paper and then check for your edge angle. If we're writing at a 30-degree angle for the lowercase forms, we then want to move down to a 15-degree angle for the capital letters. And make a few strokes just to make sure you're getting the right feeling to this edge angle. It takes a little while until you recognize how that line should look. So some warm-up strokes to prepare, and then begin making your first family of letters, the curved family of O, C, D, G, and Q. So I'm beginning here with the O stroke, and it looks a little bit narrow. So I'm going to begin again and widen the stroke a little bit more to give a full circle. After you grab the writing line, lift up and then pull up to the top and completely overlap the stroke. And go slowly on your overlap. Move your paper over so that you're looking straight on at the letter. And let's make another O form. Go slowly. And then the tail of Q begins right in the center and then slides out to the right. Notice how the paper keeps moving so that it's right in front of my eyes. A nice slow curve at the base and then up to finish with a little exit off to the left. The letter D has a very strong straight line, and the exit across the bottom is also straight with a little bit of a lift up, and then straight across the top, go into a full curve and overlap. The letter G, the same basic stroke, up to the top. And now we'll go to the center, just above the midline, pull over, down, and then slide back in to complete the stroke. And a little separation dot for our next family of letters, the thank you family. I'm going to show you first the letter H. Notice that the second stroke is the middle bar, and then up to the right-hand side to complete the letter. These letters are about 3/4 as wide as the O shape, so we can see how the O would fit directly on top of this letter. The H then fits inside the counter space of O. And here's our first letter of the thank you family, the T, starting with the horizontal bar and then the downstroke. The A also has the horizontal bar done second, just like the H, except it's going to hang under the midline, and then complete it with the right-hand side. Now check your edge angle so that from that 15 degrees that we normally have, we're now going to give it a slightly steeper angle, moving up to about 40 degrees or so for the left-hand side of N. That gives a thin side and a thicker center stroke to this letter. The letter K, we're back to our normal 15-degree edge angle, is now the normal width of a downstroke. Then slide in to hit just above the midway point in this space and exit with a diagonal. Y also goes below that midline and then finishes on the right. And the letter U, catch the feeling of O underneath that curve and then push up as far as you can, lift, and then pull down to overlap. The letter V has a slightly steeper edge angle. So that the left side is thicker than the right side. This Roman proportion is carried throughout the alphabet. The letter X, again, find the midway point in the space and then pull in to hit just slightly above that midway point. The Z begins with the normal angle for the center, then flatten to get a thick stroke, back up to 15 degrees to finish. The third family of letters in this capital group are the narrow letters. They're all based on the width of half the square. So the letter L would be half as wide as it is high. We begin with that very same stroke for the letter E, and then add the top bar, and the mid bar sits on the midway point in the space. Keep moving our paper in position, and then for F, we're going to drop that middle bar below the space where we had E. Notice how the letter P drops also below the midway line in the space, so it feels like it has that same depth as the letter F. But the B comes in a little bit higher, more like the letter E. The letter R begins like a P and then stops early. Pull a horizontal bar and attach it, and then diagonal to the right. And one of my favorite letters, the full curves of S. Make the middle stroke so that it balances on top and bottom, and then sit on the writing line and pull down and over, slide up and across to complete the letter. And the last letter in this family group is the J. Now J has a choice of either sitting on the guideline or dropping below. So I'll show you a couple versions. Slide over and then pull the bottom stroke. Or it can drop below the guideline. The counter space looks a little bit flat in this one, so let's try it again and get more of a curve on the inside counter space. Good. Calligraphers want to learn to watch the white space as we work. Our final group of letters, the M and the W, these are both wider. And notice the change in edge angle from a steep stroke to a flatter stroke, a large V shape in the middle, and then back to our flatter pen angle for the final stroke of M. M looks like a V with crutches, so make sure those crutches don't splay out too far, but just support the letter. Each of the two counter spaces on the side of M should be equal in size and equal in height. Can you see the white space and how high it is on each side? There is a symbol that was designed to represent the word and. We call it an ampersand. It begins with the first stroke looking like handlebars, and then big full curves, and then a horizontal bar. It resembles the E and the T of Latin. The et means and. And our final letter at a little bit steeper edge angle is the W. Pull each of these four strokes in. And notice that we have the first and third stroke as parallel lines. The second and fourth are also parallel lines. When we put all the letters together to form words, we want to make sure that the spaces in between each letter is approximately the same area. The only way to really do this well is optically, to just look. So trust your eyes, and as you write, just watch that space between the letters. Notice between F and this O shape, the amount of white space, and just try to mentally make that area equal to the next space that you create. So here the space between a curve and a straight line. And then finally, after the letter R, we're going to add a diagonal. And it's very difficult to measure this, so it has to be done optically. So just try to get a balance between your letters so they all have a pleasing movement across the page. Good spacing is as important as good letter forms. The space between the letters and between words can be measured. It's approximately half the distance of the letter H we would use inside the distance between these two vertical strokes. So the space between an H and an I is about half the width of the actual letter H. The space between a vertical and a curved stroke is slightly less than that, and the closest space we would have is between two curved strokes. The volume of space inside each of those areas should be equal. So it's as if we could pour sand into this space, and it should be an equal amount of sand to fill up each of these three areas. One of the most beautiful styles a calligrapher can write is the italic alphabet. This comes to us from Renaissance Italy about the 1500s, and it's pronounced italic, not italic, after the country Italy. The basic characteristics are an elliptical shape. Notice that the ellipse that's formed for this letter O is nearly parallel strokes on both sides. It would be made with the pen lift at the bottom and then coming back up to the top and pulling the right side of the stroke. I've created these forms using a double pencil technique so that I can see the overlapping of shapes and understand how the structure of one letter would fit into the other. So here we have the letter P overlapping the letter O, and then on top of the long downstroke stem for the F. The ellipse is measurable, and we can hold our pen, or in this case our pencils, horizontally and measure this inside counter space. It's approximately 1 pen width plus a little over a half. So somewhere between 1.5 to 2 pen widths wide is standard for the counter space. That's inside all of the counters, N's, A's, O's, in each of those families. We also see that these letters are sloped. Up until now, we've worked with vertical letter forms. Italic was done with a rhythm that had a beautiful movement, creating a sloped look to the forms. We also find a characteristic of italic is the branching at approximately halfway up the counter space. We begin the branching, and it shows just a little bit above that where we actually branch out. This is done by beginning to pull out, forming this elliptical curve, and then notice this rounding up here of the arch, so that this isn't a point, but rather it continues in a curve. And if you look close at this counter space, this inner space, we could see that this could look as if it's our index finger held to the side. And notice how your fingernail would be about in here. This little bit of a flattening that we see here, as if your pen has been pushed against your finger. That's how we want to look at the inside white space on an N. It helps us to view that counter space. The 45-degree edge angle is going to be modified so that some of the horizontals will be done at a flatter pen angle than we see here as our normal 45-degree angle. Some calligraphers prefer to write their italic alphabet at a 40-degree angle or even a 35-degree. This is just a starting point. Begin your forms at 45 and you can always modify them later. The body height for italic is approximately 5 pen widths tall, and you can see those marked on the side. Always check to make sure your guidelines are accurate for the pen size you've chosen. The shape of A is very important in italic, as many of the letter forms are based on this shape. I'm going to begin making this letter by pulling to the right just slightly and then pushing back to the left, curving downward, rather straight, tuck in just a little bit at the base, slide diagonally at our 45-degree angle, and then push in, pull all the way up to the top, pull straight back down, and exit. This is the same form we'll then use for the letter G, which has an extension at the bottom, a descender that would curve. The letter D would begin as an ascender and pull down. G, Q, and A are all based on this same form. The letter I begins with a serif, just as we finished on the letter A. A serif is an entrance or an exit stroke. It's really a cleanup stroke that just begins the letter with this slight hairline motion, grab up to the guideline, and pull down. Grab onto the baseline, sliding up at our 45-degree angle again to exit. We see the very same thing happening on N. The letter N could also be an R. It has the very same structure. Or it could be the beginning of the letter U, which has the same width. So we could overlap many of our letters to help understand the basic structure of italic. All right, I think we're ready to begin writing. To begin writing italic, we're going to check our guidelines to make sure they're accurate. Testing with your pen to make sure they are really 5 pen widths tall for the lowercase italic letter. And notice that the writing line, our X line, is going to be where we sit the letters, most all the letters anyway, and the waistline will be the top of those letters, like the O form or the N, and we call this space between the waistline and the writing line the X height. So this is the standard height of the letters for the italic style. The ascender line will be for the tall letters, and the descending line will be for letters like G and Y that will pull down to this bottom line. Checking our edge angle before we start, remember that we'd like to have a 45-degree angle with our edge of the nib to the writing line. So check that. Notice that some calligraphers may write their italic a little flatter at maybe a 40 or even a 35-degree edge angle, and they make a beautiful italic at that style. We're working with a basic beginning alphabet, and from here you can go on to make many changes yourself. The first letter we're going to start with is I, because it begins with this initial serif at that 45-degree angle, grabs onto the guideline, pulls down to the bottom line, and then exits with the serif. We're going to jot the I directly over the stem, put your pen down, and slightly pull uphill to the right. So it's right on top of the letter I. The first family group begins with this I stroke. And there's not a lift here, but there's a push, releasing the pressure from your pen so that very lightly you're on the paper, branch across, grab the waistline, elliptical arch, and exit. Check your letter width by measuring with your pen to make sure it's between 1.5 and 2 pen widths wide in the counter space. Other letters in this family are the U, depending upon your pen size, you may choose to do this in 1 stroke or in 2. With a larger pen, you would choose to lift right after finishing this curve. Come to the top and then pull down. Smaller pens that are easy to handle, you could do this letter all in 1 stroke. I'm continually moving my paper as I go so that my hand is always comfortable, so my letter forms look their very best. The letter M is like the N, only each of the arcades, or these arches, will be slightly narrower than we found in the letter N. The letter H begins with an ascender, so come all the way up to the ascender line. Wiggle the pen just a little bit to start the ink flowing, and then begin your pull down. This pen needs a little bit of a push at the bottom, so I have to lift just slightly. Your pens, as they're a little bit smaller, you may not need that. The slope is now becoming apparent, that our italic letters have a 5-degree letter slope. Some people like theirs at 8 or 10 degrees, but work on keeping yours about 5 degrees, just a slight slope. Slope is actually the result of speed, so the faster you go, the more slope you may notice on your letter forms. And we'll finish this family with the letter R. Begins like an N, high branch, come up to the top curve, and exit. Leaving this too wide makes it difficult to space after the letter R. The O family begins with an elliptical start. Notice the hairline, pulls down, curves, exit with the hairline, and then we'll finish the letter by pulling the next stroke as well. So pull down, begin up into the curved line, and around. C can be 1 or 2 strokes. Pull, push, pull, push. is an easy way to start the top of the letter. Some people prefer to make that a separate stroke. I like the look of this counter space inside when I've done it in one stroke. I think it makes a nice smooth form. The letter E is much like the O. In the first stroke, come back to the top, slide up, curve, and as you push in, flatten your pen angle just slightly. Now that means that my thumb is going to be pulling on the pen so that the pen is flattening the angle. Do you see the difference? From this position it's moving to this. My thumb is pushing up on the handle. Flattening it is a common term you'll hear for the rest of the alphabet anytime we have horizontals. And we can add into this letter form, or this letter family, the letter S. Keeping it narrow, all these letters are approximately the same width as the O. And I like to do S in 3 strokes, depending upon the pen that I'm using. Look at these white counter spaces and notice their shapes. They should be very similar in size. The bottom space will actually be a little bit larger, but that's so that optically the letter will appear equally spaced. The A family, I'm going to move my paper again, get it in position. The A family is one of the more difficult. We're just not used to making this form of a letter. So notice that the hand begins on the guideline with a slight pull to the right, and this allows me to press the pen. That pressure lets the ink come down to the tip of the nib, so there's plenty of ink there to then travel to the left. Pull down, curve in just a little bit. As you press around that corner, you'll then feel a release as you begin up. If your pen will, pull all the way up to the top. Hopefully they're going to meet right there, and then you'll pull right back down over that with your exit serif. Mine's sloping just a little bit too much. I'll make one more. Check the width of the counter space in your A to make sure you're approximately 1.5 to 2 pen widths in the white space. And our A family is A, D, G, Q, and then the B and P are also relatives. This is a good spot to lift at the tail so that you can then pull back to complete it. Some forms of italic, you'll see the tail beginning way up here by the writing line and pulling around to complete this large-shaped tail. Other varieties, and I tend to use both, I don't limit myself to only one form of G, but I seem to prefer this one where I'm pulling just a little bit on the tail, so it's a little bit more subtle than the large shape. And the other variety for G is to make a smaller ellipse, as if we're making an O, but keeping it approximately 1 pen width away from the writing line. This is something that we've learned from the humanist book hand, this form that has a more exaggerated tail. It's as if you're making the center of a large S. Lift, pull back to the left, curve down, and overlap at the hairline. We're constantly going to be overlapping at this hairline junction. It's much more easy to join there than to join 2 thick strokes together. And we don't want to leave off the ear of G. It's an important part of this letter form. Back to our left side of the paper, we're looking for the X, so we know we're sure to hit the writing line. And we'll continue with our A family. A, D, G, and now to Q. Q begins the same as the G. Pull, push, grab the line, slide up. And the exit is now to the right for the letter Q. Push this stroke in, and if your pen, like mine, didn't quite complete that, pull back to the right to clean that stroke. T begins just slightly over the waistline, so it's not a full ascender, it just has a slight bit of ascension, and then starting with the right corner of the nib, touching the downstroke, the left corner, and we're hanging underneath the waistline, slide to the right, and the pen angle has been flattened just slightly from where we began. Flattening this edge angle gives us a thinner horizontal stroke. Flattening again for the ascender on F, and then pull back to the normal 45-degree angle for the downstroke. Flattening at the base and pull back to the right. My F is sloping just a little bit too much. Straighten yours up at home. V can be made in one stroke or two. The one stroke variety depends again on your pen, if it will agree with you. W is really double V, and each of the V's are slightly narrower than the true V. One way of accomplishing a Y is as we did in bookhand, or a more italicized version would be making a U shape and a full descender. But the Renaissance scribes preferred this form, halfway between the bookhand Y and the U of italic. And Z, keeping our pen angle a little flatter than normal. Here's the tricky part. Change your edge angle to almost flat, almost horizontal, so that this middle stroke of Z becomes thicker. Let me show you what happens if we would keep our pen at 45 degrees. A picture is worth 1,000 words. The next few minutes you will watch the writing of an alphabet sentence, one that contains all the letters of the alphabet. When you're finished writing your alphabet sentence, take a look at the whole page and make sure that you wrote on every third line, so there's 2 full spaces between every line of writing. Notice the spacing between your letter forms. Any areas that get too tight tend to look very dark, as in the word black. You see how the B and the L and the A are a little tight together, so it shows up too dark on the page. So the next time you'd want to spread those apart a little bit more. Keep practicing like this until you're ready to use your calligraphy on some other projects. This piece by Thomas Ingmeyer was written without guidelines. You notice how the letters move freely. And the gold leaf that's been added between the letters has been put on a base of gum ammoniac. Lloyd Reynolds shows us an informal italic hand on this piece with words from himself. Now Edie Roberts shows us a unique presentation, a scroll. She has woven ribbon through the bottom of the paper that then ties it all together. I designed these 7 verses about an antique book, with the left hand 3 verses flush right and the right hand 4 verses flush left, so the center margin is well defined. I used a Gothicized italic style of letter form. Lois McClelland used an informal italic with a Carolingian flavor to write this poem by E.E. Cummings. She has such a relaxed, lightly flourished style. The numerals that we use come from an Arabic tradition from about the 15th century. The forms that I'm showing here are called old-style numerals. They have long strokes and tall strokes, as the ascenders and the descenders would have in our lowercase letter forms. When you're using these numerals with a short body height letter of only 4 pen widths tall, notice that the letters are then going to be a little thicker and a little heavier. When we use a 5 pen width tall italic, we can then elongate our numerals and also let them slope to match the letter slope on italic. The first 2, 1 and 2, are both in the body height space, and the rest of these on this page are showing how they descend approximately 1 pen width from the writing line. That occurs on the 3, notice here on the 4, and across to 9. The 0 is also body height with the 6 and the 8 ascending. That 1 pen width space is then left here at the top space. And we can't ignore the extra marks on the end. These punctuation marks are question mark, colon and semicolon, exclamation point, and comma. Notice how they fit upon your guidelines. A fun way to learn about pen control is to use your flat-edged pen for drawing. Now these artists have used this technique, and I think you'll enjoy what you find. Sally Penley has done this darling drawing of an ostrich that says the ostrich roams the great Sahara. Its mouth is wide, its neck is narrow. It has such long and lofty legs, I'm glad it sits to lay its eggs. And she's made this a playful, fun piece. Not all of our work needs to be very serious. And we see the work of Paul Freeman. This man was the first one to teach calligraphic drawing that I know of, and he was a master with manipulating that pen so that the strokes moved to create a drawing that had great contrast in thick strokes and thin strokes. Paul Freeman created this drawing of himself entirely made of letters. This self-portrait shows on his face the word eyeball used for his actual eyes. And clear down at his feet, you can see the word soul, 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 and then heel used at his feet. He's included a book which has letters surrounding it, and he has many names in there of people that were very important to him. This horse contains a quotation from the Quran about when God created the horse. Jackie Savarin is the artist, and she's used her wide pen, twisting the strokes to create the rest of the horse. Notice the tail and the way you can see the expressive feeling of the pen manipulation, the twisting to create the ending strokes on the tail and on the front mane. Even on the hooves, she's just gone up and rocked to the corner of the pen to create the lines there. When Jackie Savarin was teaching her students Roman capital letters that took a lot of pen manipulation, she chose to do calligraphic drawing in order to help the student understand how to better twist the pen. As you can see, the different angle for positioning for these strokes changes. So from a thin stroke to then create a thicker stroke requires the twisting of the pen. By doing this kind of playful drawing and having a great time with these exciting dimension of art, she's also creating the skill within the hand for creating Roman capital letters. Pen manipulation is a technique of moving the edge of the pen by twisting the hand or manipulating with your fingers. We're holding the pen with a tripod of your middle finger underneath, your index finger up on top, and the thumb on the side. And between those three, if we're holding the pen shaft up very steep to the paper, it makes it very easy to twist and turn that nib. So it's manipulated, making various line widths. This is a wonderful technique for drawing, and calligraphic drawings are drawings that are done with a broad-edged pen that could then incorporate these same shapes onto a piece that has letter forms. So they relate much better than if you were just doing a straight line drawing and then adding those onto a piece that had been written with shaded letters. Twisting the pen takes a little bit of practice. Start as if you're making a letter and then keep twisting further. This is a technique that we would use in learning how to make serifs at the top of letters. You can see how that could be applied to a Roman capital letter. We need to keep reloading our pen often so that there's plenty of liquid. If we run it a little bit dry, it'll be difficult to continue, especially on a paper with some texture. This has a little texture to it, a little tooth, and so it grabs the ink and pulls it right out of my nib. So as we twist, feel how you can just play with this twisting motion. And don't worry about what letter it might look like, but notice the fun you can have in going from one pen edge angle to another and just make patterns. Making pages of these patterns could be used for projects like wrapping paper or just abstract designs. But it's the twisting, manipulating practice that's going to make us accomplished pen people, so that as we work with any alphabet, we're going to have confidence that our hand can produce the desired strokes. Now watch the fingers and watch the end of the pen nib as it turns. Now I can come back up here to make a wick, and I could even add a couple flame strokes to the candle. I'm using white gouache. It's an opaque watercolor paint, and I've mixed it with some water so that it's rather thick, the consistency of cream. And I'm not concerned at all about making every line perfect, but rather letting them have some interesting motion, so that as you see the strokes being made, you can see the twisting. I'm not concerned about whether or not I've covered everything on there. I kind of like it with a little bit showing to the side. So I could now make a little rest for this candle to sit on. I could add more lines as texture, or simply just enjoy it as a drawing on its own. Try a bell, or a book, or your jar of ink. Something simple to begin your drawing, and just remember to keep twisting, keep turning, and feel that the control is right here in your fingers At any position that you move, you are in control of that pen and can decide exactly what shape this line ought to take. Keep a journal of ideas, of possible quotations, something that you really feel strongly about. You can find many choices in bookstores of blank books that are available for you to use as notebooks or as journals. This is one of my journals, and I've used this one to keep my notes that have great meaning to me. And this may be something that I use later on as a finished product. But for now, they start out as thumbnail sketches, as just writing down a quotation and feeling some possibilities for them. As you can see on the pages, I even include some drawings of things that I think I might want to use later on. Other journals that I've kept have included class notes. One year I took a workshop for 2 weeks with Lloyd Reynolds, who was one of our greatest Northwest teachers. And this was a handmade book, and I like the way it feels. Choose one that's really special to you. And I've even kept in there photographs of this 2-week workshop and some of the things that we worked on in that class. Some of the things that Lloyd Reynolds said that really struck me as important. So your journal can be your own handwriting, or you can work on changing that handwriting, as I've been doing. I'm trying to write italic handwriting. So as you work on that, you'll find ways of incorporating page designs and page layouts that can be used for further projects, as well as notes on particular letter forms that you're trying to work with. Aha Calligraphy has a special touch. It has to do with not only the outside work that you do in your journal or the work that you do out on paper, but it has to do with the inner work, the work that you do inside, what you're saying to yourself as you're working. There are 3 basic rules for this inner work that I'd like to present. The first one is, you are exactly as you should be. Don't try to be any farther along than you are, but to enjoy exactly where you are right now in your own professional development. And 2, be as kind to yourself as you would be to anyone else. You can relax. You have plenty of time to train the hand muscles, to learn the letter forms. Don't worry about being any farther along than you are right now. Suspend your judgment. You don't have to be quite as critical as you may tend to be at the beginning. Just relax and enjoy the motion. And the third rule is to follow your bliss. Joseph Campbell reminds us of those words. And I think that's important as we work, that it's our own inner work that's being called to be done. That it's making our mark that's important. Not exactly copying anyone else, but to do it exactly as you would do it. There are many wonderful projects that a calligrapher can use to show their artwork. One of them could be, as we see in this illustration by Louise Grunwald, using color. Here she has written with a wide-edged pen with water, and then she's dropped on color drops to make these vibrant colors that you see throughout the piece. The small writing was done with a small pen, and then she's used a much wider pen for doing the large shapes. All that we see is vision from generated organs, gone as soon as come, permanent in the imagination, considered as nothing by the natural man. Lloyd Reynolds wrote this quotation in a style that's very reminiscent of his personality. He liked things simple, he liked clean lines, he liked them very straightforward, and the style that we see here is black on white paper, and the only color that he may choose to use is vermilion, a red-orange. Barry Morenz is a calligrapher from New York City. He's very well known for his style called a Gothicized italic, and he's very fond of writing Shakespeare sonnets. Here's an example that shows his great versatility with the pen, and the way this alphabet packed together gives a delightful texture that really calls the viewer into the piece to get closer and to look a little bit closer for the detail work. This is a practice page that I did while trying to learn the alphabet called Batard. And as you can see, I'm working at various sizes on this piece, so I've used graph paper instead of ruling guidelines. The graph paper enables me to use one of the spaces or two or three, depending on the size pen I'm using. This is a very good way to learn an alphabet, just to take one large sheet and continually practice at various sizes, so your hand is learning the rhythm and the tempo that it takes to accomplish this particular style. Now that we've practiced writing on horizontal guidelines, this is an opportunity to try writing on curving lines. You may choose to write with a pencil on a dark paper so that you can see the curved lines, or when you're feeling secure enough, you may just try writing without them and just let your letters enlarge and diminish as you move. On this piece, I've used gold leaf on the illustration of my hand to go along with the letters that are moving and have a lot of gracefulness, I feel like, in this piece. It says, "You are made perfect in gold." This is a piece that I've just completed recently called "The Healing of the Nations." And I've incorporated many of the techniques we've been looking at in this program, such as the large letters for a heading. These were done with a flat-edged brush that we'll be seeing on another program. The smaller letters down below that heading are all done with a pen, and the bottom line of that was done by writing with a pen on a different sheet of paper and then outlining those and painting just the background. The incorporation here for me was of taking a large amount of text and trying to make it work without being stiff. So I've started by writing on no guidelines, blank paper, so that there's a natural movement and a rhythm to the lines. And then as it continues down the side, you can see how sometimes the lines get straight and sometimes they spread out a little bit. And I like the movement. I like the energy that happens when the text looks comfortable. It doesn't look too contrived or pushed between guidelines. Edward Johnston was talked about at the beginning of the tape as the man who said, "Writing between ruled lines is like trying to dance in a room your own height." So dancing for me on the paper meant no guidelines. As we can see, I've used some watercolor illustration, some gilding techniques, which is the addition of gold leaf. And that gold leaf brings light to the paper. That's why some of these pages were called illuminations. They would bring light. And the sparkle that you see from the metallic, I think, brings your concentration in to the symbols that have been used for this particular text. This is done by, from a book called Vision by Ken Carey, and his message is that nations are healed because people are healed. So the text is talking about how we can each work on getting the peace within ourselves first, and then we'll see how that can spread throughout all the nations. There are so many alphabet possibilities that it would be impossible to recreate all of them for this production. I would love to show you some of the ways other calligraphers and artists have used these possibilities. So I have an assortment of samples that we're going to look at that include this that I did several years ago in a book form with an illuminated letter in the beginning, and then continuing with this alphabet style throughout. It has a great texture, wonderful flourishes, and I matched the text to then the gray on the cover. We see this newsletter cover, the Valley Calligraphy Guild from Eugene, Oregon, that is featuring a sample alphabet that I created not long ago that's very exciting visually because there's small lines and the thick lines, and it's also very unusual. These letter forms haven't been demonstrated before. So as you look at these, hopefully you'll get the feeling of the motion and the movement possible by just playing with drawing thick and thin lines to create an energetic style of writing. This is a text in italic in a rather cursive manner with some of the joins between the letters. That gives it a more casual appearance. This could be folded up and included with a newsletter or a Christmas greeting, or it could be put into a small frame. This is a Christmas card that was designed by Betty Locke, and I noticed the way she's used her different alphabet forms to make them drawings for her Christmas trees, and then inside she has her greeting carrying through this made-up form that reminds us of her Christmas tree design. Carol Erickson has written on fabric with her pen, and she's created a piece that is stitched in between as if they are guidelines, and the writing then continues to spiral all the way in. So those of you that like needle and thread could also work with calligraphy on your fabric. This is another sample of a book, only a very small version. It even has a little carrot closure. And notice that that carrot theme is carried through. As you see, the letter forms that are beautiful, based on these little humanist bookhand letter forms, hand printed, hand bound, in this lovely little closure. This is also a closure that makes it a book form with a little piece of bamboo, and this is simply a holder for a finished piece. Mary Lou Thomas is the artist, and she's created this piece on real parchment, which is an animal skin that has been specially prepared, and then she's done this lovely painting using gouache and a very small brush, and the written forms are those Roman capitals but done without guidelines, so they have a little liveliness to their positioning. And the last one is a very tiny little book that has a letter form that is this basic little capital letter form that we've been practicing, but piled in together so the spaces between the letters are highlighted with color, and then tiny little caps that are stretched out for the greeting. So the variety is endless. We can work in small patterns, in books, we can work in large patterns, we can do large pages of work, all of them to create some special treasure with your calligraphy. We've covered a lot of material. You've learned a lot. Depending upon your ability level right now, as a beginner, you may find that you're overwhelmed, that there's too much to assimilate at this time. Go slowly with yourself. You can review this video as many times as you'd like, put it on pause, spend a little time practicing, and then come back to it. You can always concern yourself with the manual as well. It has good model forms that you can follow along and some more information. Intermediate students, you've noticed a few fine points that you can use now to tune up your letter forms. And advanced students, it may be fun for you to feel like you're a beginner again, to go back to the beginning, to enjoy that feeling that, oh, it's new again and it's exciting again. There are some other points I'd like you to remember. That first of all, whatever tools are available to you will be just fine. Don't worry about having the exact tool. The alphabet varieties are limitless. Begin with a simple bookhand or a foundational style, some Roman capitals and italic, and that's plenty to begin you. That'll last for many years. Move on only when you feel ready and you feel like you have a little confidence with these styles. Study your letter forms through the skeleton forms, the bone structure of the letters. So in the family width groups, you're understanding their structure. Discover the spaces, inside letters, outside letters. Let them help you determine the positioning for your letter forms. Have patience with your hand. You're training the muscles of the hand as if you were an athlete ready for a race. It takes time, it takes patience. When you're working with projects, make sure that you're doing real things, useful things. Make things you can give away. Do a greeting card. And especially, do your inner work. The outer work and the inner work together go hand in hand to form aha calligraphy, the moment of sudden insight when you feel re-inspired and creative.